Hello and welcome to BUtalks, the podcast where we build our souls as well as our CVs. I am your host, Florence Olivia Jeunesse, and today we are interviewing Dr. Corinne Haigh, an associate professor with the Department of Education and a recipient of research grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Fonds de recherche sur la société et la culture. Dr. Haigh investigates the cross-linguistic aspects of language processing in bilinguals. She works with pre-service teachers as well as in-service teachers, school administrators, and parents in our local community and beyond to share research findings about bilingual education for all students, particularly those at risk for difficulty in learning and more particularly with language and literacy skills. We would like to thank the Experiential Learning Internship Grant Fund for making this podcast possible, as well as the Bishop's Bookstore and the Advancement Office. I would also first like to acknowledge the territory on which we hold the BUtalks today as the traditional and unceded territory of the Abenaki First Nations and the Abenaki Confederation. In performing land acknowledgement, we make what was once invisible visible, and we invite today in our conversation the land, the Abenaki and First Nations people, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission into our conversations today. So Dr. Haigh, welcome, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So I would first like to ask you, as a professor of education, how do you think your education has prepared you for your role of professor and researcher?
So that's an interesting question. I think that if we're talking kind of strictly about my graduate education, that it prepared me very well for my role as a researcher and to a degree for some of the service roles that I'm part of. So I was recently the chair of my department for 6 months, and so for some of those activities, in terms of the teaching part of my job, I wouldn't say that my graduate education really prepared me very well for that. And I don't think that's uncommon actually for most professors, that they don't get a lot of specific support around teaching connected to their later role as a professor, if that's what they choose to pursue. So that's a bit of a strange feature of how one's education leads them to become a professor. There's some disconnects there for sure. Yeah.
And what is the most important thing you learned from your experience at university, whether it is at the undergraduate level or graduate?
Yes, I would say that you need to look for opportunities and take them as they're presented to you, and sometimes a path that you might not have thought about originally ends up being the best one for you. And so it's important to kind of think about all the things that are happening around you and to remember that while you might be in a place to study a particular thing, that sometimes joining a club or participating in a research project with somebody is going to lead to some really interesting kind of outcome later on. And so I think that's probably that's a pretty general lesson, I guess, but I'd say that's the biggest thing I took away from my education is, look for opportunities and make the most of them.
Excellent. And well, you went to Mount Allison as an undergraduate degree. And how did you find out about Bishop's University, and why did you choose Bishop's University?
Well, it's given that I went to Mount Allison, I was pretty sure that I was looking for a place like Bishop's when I made the decision to pursue careers in academia after finishing my PhD. And so it's funny because I didn't actually plan to go to Mount Allison. My dad went to McGill, and I grew up on the South Shore of Montreal, and so I was going to McGill, that was the plan. And at my CEGEP, Mount Allison had a booth and they were doing recruiting, and the person I talked to was just really convincing. She was like, you're going to have a great experience, and it's a small community, and I'm not a super outgoing person, but for whatever reason I was like, this sounds like a really good idea. And I went home and I was like, I think I want to apply to Mount Allison. My parents were like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, this is not what you've been talking about at all. And so I did, and it was the best decision I could have made. And so that experience that I had at Mount A and the friends I made, people I'm still friends with now, and really kind of shaped what happened to me afterwards. And so when I started to look for academic positions, I really thought, that's the type of institution I want to be part of. That's the type of university and the type of environment. And so, I'll be honest with you, I applied to a lot of different places because the academic job market is tough, but I knew that this was going to be a place like Bishop's was going to be the best fit for me. And so, when that position came along, I was really excited to get the call to say we'd like to interview you. So,
yeah, we would love to know about your teaching and learning philosophy.
So I guess at the heart of how I think about teaching and learning is really that it has to be a partnership between the teacher and the learner. So, definitely moving away from these models of like knowledge transmission. I'm going to tell you the stuff you need to know, and more, how can we collaborate together to answer questions that are important to the learner, but that as the teacher, I also think, it's important that we think about. So definitely a lot of partnership and interaction. And also the idea that ultimately students need to self-regulate their own learning. So, there's a big body of research that tells us that if you don't have a reason to learn something, you won't learn it. So it's important that you personally have a connection to it, and sometimes it's going to mean like you're really interested in it, or sometimes it's going to be really practical, like I need to know this to get to this next step. So it's not that you have to love every moment of your learning experience. I don't think that's realistic, but you have to have a goal in mind. And so I think it's important to work with students, both young and university age, to say like, what is your goal for this particular activity, this thing we're doing this semester, and how are you going to get there, and then how can I support you in getting there as well. So, setting up kind of that framework as a way to think about learning in the classroom, and then helping students to work towards the steps they need to take to answer their own questions or meet their own goals.
To continue with what you just said, what do you hope your student will take out from your classes?
Well, so I teach as you said, I teach in the School of Education. So, there's some really practical things that I hope students will take away. But a lot of the courses I teach are about the more theoretical foundations in education. So I'm not a classroom teacher. I never have been. I'm actually an experimental psychologist by training. So, I'm teaching a lot of foundations in educational psychology, the foundations of language and literacy. And so in our School of Education, we have an outcome statement for students at the end of their studies with us. And one of the lines is that our pre-service teachers will see teaching both as an intellectual pursuit and a social responsibility. And so I would say that those are the two things that really drive kind of my teaching and the learning objectives I set in my classes. And I really hope that when students come away from the classes they take with me, that it's with the idea that there's no possible way I could have told them everything they'll need to know, to meet the needs of every single student they're going to encounter, but that they'll have the skills and the knowledge to know where to look for more information, how to decide if that information is good or not. And also knowing what they don't know, and being willing to connect with other people who can serve as a resource for them. So it's really the intellectual pursuit part definitely drives a lot of the things I do in the classroom, because there's this idea that teaching is both an art and a science, and so there's definitely a research literature that supports a lot of the things we do when we teach. And so it's really just getting our pre-service teachers connected to that literature and comfortable with where to find the answers they might need.
What pedagogical changes do you see on the horizon of your discipline?
A lot of the courses I teach have a focus on inclusive education. So the idea that we want all learners in classroom settings to be engaged and included, and not just included like because they're sitting at a desk beside another student, but meaningfully included. And so there are some approaches to designing learning and evaluation situations that help people to plan for the needs of those learners from the beginning. And I hope that certainly I would say in the K to 11 system, that's happening more and more. But even in higher education, this is where I would hope there would be some more meaningful change. I hope that we're starting to get away from the idea that, you know, one size fits all, and that just teaching in one way. So, you know, as an example, a traditional lecture, you know, based classroom is going to necessarily meet the needs of all students. So, but the approach to teaching would be differentiated instruction, and the idea is that you want to think about the learning objective you have. So I would like students to be able to critically appraise resources connected to my topic by the end of the semester. And then think about all the different activities you could plan so that students could get to that goal, but getting away from the idea that if every single person doesn't do it one way, that is somehow wrong or not, you know, rigorous enough, or the idea that if, you know, one of my learning objectives for a class I'm teaching about educational psychology is that you're able to describe the main characteristics of the cognitive approach to teaching, that you could write me an essay about that, or you could do a podcast about that, or you could create a poster about that, and all of those are equally valid ways to demonstrate your learning to me. And so my hope is that, you know, kind of that we're coming more towards the idea that inclusion isn't just a philosophical thing that we all believe, but we're actually starting to take more concrete actions.
Yeah. How have you gone making your research relevant to the communities outside of the university?
So I'm lucky because I'm sure you might ask, education's a pretty applied field already. So, but as I said, you know, I'm trained as an experimental psychologist, so it took me a little while to get to the more applied side of things. And so I started off studying, I guess in a nutshell, how bilingual people kind of manage both of their languages when they're performing a task like reading. So I was interested in, you know, if I give you something to read in English, is French kind of active in the background if you're a French-English bilingual? So I started off doing that, and I just did experiments kind of in a lab setting where people read words on a computer screen. But I was always really interested in children and how they learn to read. That was really kind of what was driving my reasons for going into psychology, and also I was really interested in just bilingual people too, because I grew up in Quebec, and I'm from an Anglophone family. Anyway, so I was interested kind of just in my personal experience, and then those things just started to get closer and closer together, and then I started to be interested in how bilingual kids learn to read, and my PhD supervisor had started this project that was new for her, where she was doing a longitudinal study of bilingual kids in French immersion programs in Ontario, and she was going to follow them from kindergarten to grade 3, and she was looking for research assistants, and she was like, hey, I know this isn't your main line of research, but would you like to work as an RA for me? And I was like, yeah, that would be great. So I started doing that project, and I loved it. I was like, oh, this is what I want to do, but it was kind of too late to change my PhD, and so I finished the project that I was doing, and it was interesting. I still liked it, but and then I started looking for opportunities after my PhD, and I ended up doing a postdoc with Fred Genesee at McGill, and his research has always been very connected to schools and communities and French immersion programs, and so he gave me an opportunity to actually lead a project like the one I was an RA in. And so now I was doing a longitudinal study of children in classrooms learning French and English, and I was partnered with a speech-language pathologist, which we still work together. We love working together, actually. It was such a great opportunity that we met. And so just naturally, my research has kind of started to become more and more applied and more working with kids in schools. And to answer questions around, you know, what are some best practices with respect to literacy instruction for bilingual children, but really more specifically, what is the experience of kids who struggle with skills like reading and language in second language programs? Because people's initial reaction often is, okay, well, this kid is having trouble reading, and so if they're having trouble reading in one language, then why are we going to have them read in 2 languages? Like, this is a bad idea. We should eliminate that factor and things will go better. But really, there's no research that actually demonstrates that that's true. And if you think about the experience of growing up, say, in Sherbrooke, it's actually really beneficial for kids to learn 2 languages if you want them to have meaningful employment later, if you want them just to be able to interact with kids on their soccer team. So a lot of the research I do now is focused on kind of answering the question of whether or not those kids should be included in bilingual education, and meeting with parents and policymakers and administrators about the research that we, not just that I've done, but that other people have done, to kind of present it to them, and talk about what the implications might be for policy around bilingual education for kids who are struggling.
Is there a moment in your classroom or in your experience in the academia where you help your students build their souls instead of their resume?
But every year I organize a conference on campus called the Individual Differences Conference. So I teach a course in the final year of our BEd program that's about individual differences in the classroom. So children with autism spectrum disorders, children with reading difficulties, children who have experienced divorce, all kinds of topics that might impact learning in the classroom. And students in my class choose a topic that's of interest to them, and then they work on a project over the course of the semester. So they create a brochure, they write a paper, they create an academic poster, and then we put on a conference. And I would say that, kind of in feedback I get about my teaching, that's one of the activities that, is kind of built into my classes that I get the most feedback on, where students say, at the beginning of the semester, I was going to do the project because I have to do it. It's worth 60% of my grade, the whole thing. But, as I went along, I was like, actually, I know way more about this than I thought I was going to, and I feel really confident. And so the experience of we put the conference on at the gate, and we invite the Bishop's community. So we get a lot of education students who come, but we also invite Champlain. We invite local teachers, we invite professors, and a lot of students will say, I didn't think I was going to be able to explain this to somebody else, I really felt like I was an expert in my topic, and it was such a good experience to be able to share that knowledge with somebody else and get their take on it. And it's not like presenting just to my class, because that's kind of an artificial situation. People ask me questions and sometimes I didn't know how to answer them, but so I would say that a lot of students have told me that for them, I'm sure it's a little bit different for everybody, but for some students it made them feel more confident than they thought they did, or it helped them to learn that maybe their presentation skills were stronger than they thought, or and so I think I love that conference. It's really positive experience for me too, and I always say to the students at the beginning of the semester, I know you're really stressed about this conference, but I'm not stressed at all, because it's always one of the best moments in the semester, and I'm sure that you're all going to be amazing, and they are consistently. So.
Is there moments where your students have taught you rather than you teaching your students?
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
I would say that happens all the time. For me, often it's in them bringing their experience to whatever we're talking about. So because I am a teacher. Now I have to stop saying I'm not a teacher, because it's not true. I'm a university professor, so I teach, but I'm not a classroom teacher. I've not taught the children who my students are going to teach. So it's a weird situation to be in sometimes, because I'm saying to them, you should do this. I try not to say that really that directly, but this might be an approach you'd want to take. And then sometimes they'll say back to me, well, in my practicum, I tried doing that and it didn't work. I'm like, okay, well, we have to talk about that then. Why didn't it work? Let's deconstruct this. Was it something about the context? Is the school different from, the school I was thinking of when I made that suggestion, or the schools that the research has been conducted in that led me to make that recommendation? So a lot of the time students will come with their own experience from being in a practicum, or sometimes we'll be talking about a learning disability and a student in the class will say, well, actually, I have dyslexia. And so, yeah, that's really true for me, or, not so much. And whenever students are willing to volunteer that information, it always enriches the conversation, and I'm always so thankful to them for being willing to bring their experience to that situation. But it always teaches me something about, maybe I have to think about presenting that differently, or maybe, that research literature is out of date, or sometimes it's that, no, actually the research does say this, but that really wasn't their experience. So how do we reconcile that? So yeah, it definitely raises a lot of interesting questions for me.
And how do you navigate the world, and what is your hope for higher education?
Well, I think one of the hopes, I touched on it earlier, is that that higher education can be more inclusive of a diversity of perspectives and learners. And so right now, higher education is pretty focused on a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think at Bishops we do a good job of recognizing that you as students are whole people with lives and a lot of different experiences. But I still think that higher education has a ways to go in recognizing that not everybody is going to approach learning the same way. And if we want to make sure that some communities that have been less engaged in higher education, for example, Indigenous communities, are better represented in higher education, then we're going to have to start being more willing to change our practice and to adapt more to the needs of all learners, and maybe even just get away from this idea that we're adapting and just be inclusive. Yeah. So it's a tall order, and I think it's going to require a lot of multifaceted change, from instructors in the classroom all the way up to administrative structures. But I guess that would be my kind of big hope for higher education, is that more people will be able to see themselves as being part of universities, and will feel that they're being meaningfully included.
Growing up in Montreal, in the province of Quebec, how do you feel like the education is different from the maybe the North American systems?
As for Quebec, I think one of the interesting features about the Quebec education system is cégep, actually, and the fact that out of high school you can attend, not completely free, but very well subsidized higher education, and you can do a 3-year DEP that will lead you to, in a lot of cases, a career. Yeah. And so I think that for some people who initially are like, well, no, that's really what I want. Like, I want a job and a stable income and a car and a house, and that's very appealing. And so, but I also think that it's great, actually, that we value people's ability to choose kind of that path for themselves, if that's what they think is what they want to do. Well, and I think it's interesting too, because some of the ability to apply into a program like law directly out of cégep is pretty unique to Quebec. Yeah. So I think we've set up a system, actually, that suggests to people that that's a good route to take, and for some people maybe it is, but I'm a believer in this model of education as well, and I think that having rich experience to bring to bear to and also just the ability to engage in a topic from multiple directions, like historically, economically, geographically, is really valuable to pretty much any profession you might, exactly. Medicine, law, So yeah, that's an interesting. You're right. It's an interesting feature, actually. The unique thing about in the School of Education, you can't do that, right? So in education, in Quebec, all programs are concurrent. So you have to do at least 4 years and really be immersed in that. And I actually think that that's one of the best reasons, if anyone is watching this who's thinking about applying to Bishops, it's one of the best reasons to do education at a place like Bishops or in any province that offers a concurrent degree, because you have so much more time, like you were just saying, to really engage deeply with the topic. And, so
what keeps you up at night? So what are the...
My 3-year-old? No. That's one of the things that keeps me up at night. What keeps me up at night? Let me think. Well, so I'm a really good sleeper. So. No, I understand where you're going with the question. Well, there are so many things that could keep me up at night. I think we're, in a lot of ways, we're a society in transition right now, and there seem to be some major conversations that need to be had about a lot of things. And so, some of those things are the things keeping me up at night. Why are there still perfect school shootings in the United States, and what does that mean for me teaching pre-service teachers, and how do we prepare them for being in situations like that hopefully aren't going to occur here, but how do we even engage with big questions like that? Those are the types of things that I wonder about, and being involved in a program like education means that I'm teaching my courses, but I also think a lot about our students and the experiences they're having over the whole course of the program, and being chair last semester actually really let me see kind of all the different little pieces of what we're doing, and are there gaps, and so are there topics we should be talking about. I had a student recently approach me, and he said to me, I love our program, but is there going to be a time when you're going to talk to us about what to do if a student discloses that they're having suicidal thoughts? And I said, I'm genuinely not sure. If somebody else is doing that in their class, I'm not doing it. Why aren't we doing that? So, there are some, I feel like we took a really dark turn here, but yeah, there are big questions like that. Like, am I playing a role in adequately preparing, not am I by myself, but are we adequately preparing our students to encounter, the very real changes that are occurring on a societal level, and how that's going to impact students in classrooms. So I guess that's one of the things that keeps me up at night. I mean, there are other less heavy things, sometimes, after I just had the opportunity to give a full day workshop to a group of ESL, so English as a Second Language teachers, and I was presenting with my colleague Caroline, the speech language pathologist I mentioned earlier. So we often will do this together. We will give workshops for teachers and parents and administrators, and so it was like this first time we'd had a whole day. So we had 5 hours, and we engaged, in really interesting discussion, and they had us, we were so amped up by the end of the day. We were like, oh my goodness, now next time we do this workshop, we have to add this, and we have to talk more about this, and we have to email Fred Genesee to ask him about this book, and I got home and I was just like, my husband was like, okay, I guess that went really well, but I was really, it's so energizing sometimes to, and sometimes I feel this way too after a great class with students as well. They'll just give me so many ideas. And I'm like, I have to come up with a collaborator to look at this.
Well, thank you very much for being here today. We are really grateful to have you on campus as a professor and researcher. And, thank you for being part of the BUtalks series.
You're very welcome, and thanks to all of you for doing this. I think this is a really interesting project, and I hope that you're enjoying talking to a whole bunch of people from campus, and I can't wait to hear it too. So, yeah.